Lord, let there be peace among the children. Let there be peace. Let there be...
Welcome to Reflections. Your speaker is the Reverend Eron Henry of Alexandria, Virginia, in the United States.
In his book, Trouble I've Seen, Drew Hart points out that to understand the conditions under which oppressed and marginalized people live, one has to see things from their perspective. One cannot remain inside one's dominant culture and speak truthfully about the life and experience of those on the margins. It is perhaps why Matthew Desmond was able to write a book that has gained attention in the United States. His book, Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City, draws on the thesis that the major cause of poverty in the USA today is the high rate of evictions experienced by those on the margins of society, the poor in particular. Housing evictions affect minority groups, African Americans and Latinos, disproportionately higher than it does others. Perhaps the reason Desmond's book resonates with so many is because Desmond, the son of a pastor, spent months living in a trailer park and in an inner-city community in the city of Milwaukee. During these months, he saw firsthand the experience of those who lived on the margins, who lived and led precarious existence because they could not access affordable housing and who were constantly evicted from their homes. Drew Hart explained that Dietrich Bonhoeffer had a life-changing experience while a student at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. Bonhoeffer was of a privileged background and had a privileged upbringing and education. The theology he learned in Germany was traditional. Hart suggests that for Bonhoeffer's New York experience, he would probably have fallen in line behind Hitler and the Nazis, as so many German pastors did. But in New York, Bonhoeffer came in touch with Christian pacifism and, even more importantly, became friends with a fellow African-American student who did internship at Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem, a predominantly African-American congregation. Bonhoeffer worshipped at Abyssinian and hung out in Harlem and therefore became aware of what life was like for those who lived on the margins of American society. Martin Luther King Jr. grew up as an upper-middle-class child and youth in Atlanta. He had a thoroughly middle-class upbringing and education at Morehouse College and Boston University. The first church he pastored, Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, catered to middle and upper-middle-class blacks. Yet, while he served in Montgomery, Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat on a bus to a white man forced the hands of the black community in Montgomery to respond, including a young and eloquent Martin Luther King, who, based on reports, was initially reluctant to get involved. But when he did, a civil rights leader and icon was born. It is difficult to remain detached and know what is happening to people. I reread the first 6 books of the Bible in their entire length not so long ago, and frankly, I saw some things for the first time. For instance, I've always had the notion that Moses spent his entire childhood in Pharaoh's palace as the son of Pharaoh's daughter from the very time he was drawn from the river, but the text says differently. The story contains one of the best forms of deceptions I believed I've read anywhere, when Miriam presented Moses' mother to the Egyptian princess as the child's wet nurse. It is likely the princess was unaware that the new wet nurse was actually the infant's mother. The passage says, Pharaoh's daughter said to her, Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you. So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. Yes, Moses eventually ended up in the palace, but at least for some period, if the text is to be taken at face value, he grew up within the Jewish community among those who were enslaved. He knew what life among the enslaved was like. He had his mother and father around him. He grew up around his older siblings, Miriam and Aaron. He slept where they slept, ate the food they had, walked the places they did. Perhaps he had privileges others didn't, but he was not wholly detached from the marginalized, enslaved Jews. It makes greater sense as to why, as a young man, he reacted as he did to the Egyptian taskmaster beating an enslaved Jew. Moses was so enraged that he committed murder and escaped as a fugitive. Living among his people made such deep impression on him that years later he risked life and limb going back to Egypt, confronting Pharaoh and leading the Jews out of bondage into freedom. The word we use for identifying with those on the underside of society is solidarity. But true solidarity occurs only when one is in sync with what is going on among those with whom one is in solidarity. One cannot remain aloof, detached, and be in full solidarity. The greatest example of solidarity with the marginalized is Jesus. He was born on the underside of Jewish society and grew up among the common people. Drew Hart stated it well. Jesus had a humble beginning. His company was not Caesar nor Pilate, and certainly not Herod. The audience of the great moment of his birth beyond his parents was shepherds. These were the undesirable and despised underclass of society. In his ministry, Jesus mixed and mingled the poor, destitute, and unwanted, and often chastised the rich and the powerful. He was busy healing the sick and restoring the outcast so they could fully participate in society, affirming their dignity as humans loved by God, Hart declared. Jesus himself said it best when he quoted Isaiah, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Jesus affirmed this fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy. Today the scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. If Paul is to be believed, the early church, or at the very least, segments of the early church, comprised those on the margins. Brothers and sisters, he wrote to the Corinthians, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. If we are to be faithful to the Jewish prophetic tradition, to the Gospels, and to the claims of other parts of the New Testament, our mission, commitment should primarily be toward those on the underside of society. This, in fact, is part of the attraction of the Christian church in its purest form. Early Christianity attracted immigrants in large cities such as Rome and Ephesus who had little or no connections, oftentimes having no homes, who were deprived and felt alienated. They engaged in professions and livelihoods that placed them among the despised. Their status as slaves made them vulnerable, and their gender placed them at risk. The church did all this, not from a distance, not from an abstract place, but down in the gutter, in the trenches, where the dejected and the rejected worked and lived. It is a calling on the church that has never been rescinded, that has never been compromised, that has never been withdrawn. It is a challenge to which the church should respond.
That was Reverend Eron Henry. Reverend Henry worked for a global Christian nonprofit for more than 12 years and traveled to 30 countries. He is an expert in global Christian mission and international religious affairs. He is the author of Reverend Mother, a novel available on Amazon.com. You may follow Reverend Henry on Facebook or on Twitter. You may book Reverend Henry for speaking engagements by writing to eronhenry@yahoo.com. That is EronHenry@yahoo.com. Among the topics he covers are congregational renewal and how to engage in effective Christian mission. I am Joyville, and be sure to listen to the next installment of our podcast, Reflections.
Lord, let there be peace among the children. Let there be peace. Let there be peace around the world.